Across Canada's most isolated shorelines and profoundest depressions, implausible rock configurations ascend with contours too exacting and too peculiar to overlook. Spires sculpted as though by invisible artisans, countenances gazing from escarpments no one recalls incising, whole elevations molded like slumbering silhouettes safeguarding the terrain. Scholarship elucidates portions of it, but not the inconsistencies, not the motifs, not the particulars that ought not to persist. Why do these configurations mirror one another, spanning thousands of miles? What fashioned them? And what might they be indicating? Prior to the conclusion of this video, you'll encounter indications that transform how you perceive lithic forever. Percé Rock, along the peripheral rim of the Gaspé Peninsula, where the Gulf of St. Lawrence curves into elongated, languid undulations that appear to respire against the coast, Percé Rock ascends as if hewn from a recollection antedating the ocean itself. Its enormous limestone bulk, erect in serene opposition to the forces that have molded it across millions of years. And yet its essence evokes less a lithological vestige, and more a lone sentinel maintaining vigil over a breadth of epochs too expansive to designate. For its sheer facade, streaked with rust-hued iron accumulations and interspersed by fossil-laden strata, intimates a chronicle assembled, stratum by stratum, when this territory submerged beneath primordial seas. Its aquatic organisms subsiding into mud substrates that solidify into lithic, prior to continental drift elevating them into illumination. And as gulls circle above the grand vault that formerly characterized the rock's outline, now progressively attenuating beneath the unyielding labor of breeze, frost, and surge, the edifice summons not merely an innate landmark, but a limen, a locale where numerous societies have halted, documented or re-envisioned, the terrain's odd allure, and where primordial. Native voyagers regarded the soaring bulk as integral to a literal realm, vibrant with essence and reminiscence, its fluctuating tones and tempestuous climbs resounding along the bluffs like remote percussion. While subsequently, European adventurers, bewildered by the fluxes that unveil and veil the ocean floor with ceremonial meticulousness, observed its magnitude with equivalent measures of intrigue and disquiet. Yet the nearer one scrutinizes, the more the rock's exterior discloses a subdued repository of archaic vitality. Brachiopods, trilobites, and coral remnants encased within its barriers, like inner punctuations from an extinct sea. And from these vestiges, scholars reconstruct the gradual ballet of elevation, abrasion, and atmospheric alteration that fashioned the configuration into its current perimeters. Although the very implements employed to interpret this chronicle also unveil a conundrum of divergent elucidations. For while the principal account directs toward glacial withdrawal, an inexorable maritime scouring, particular acutely angled ruptures and solitary spires, encircling the foundation, provoke inquiries into whether intermittent seismic throbs or confined subsidence incidents once wielded a more theatrical impact than heretofore presumed. And the prodigious extent of rubble expanses around the inundated periphery alludes to paroxysms of abrupt structural forfeiture that certain have associated with tempestuous inundations or ephemeral sea elevation irregularities, though these linkages linger, provisional and arduous, and as marine scientists scrutinize how surge harmonics in the adjacent passage concentrate strain along specific fault trajectories, their conclusions merely amplify the impression that the obelisk's perseverance constitutes an equilibrium of fragile dynamics where infinitesimal alterations in periodic gelid thaw sequences, or nuanced fluctuations in gale ferocity, can modify its destiny. While cultural chroniclers drawing upon voyagers' ledgers from the 17th and 18th centuries observe depictions of resonances, detonations, fissures, and subdued oscillations that contemporaries ascribe to apparitions or concealed grottos, even as contemporary interpretations incline toward frost, splintering, or atmospheric compression inside constricted crevices. Still, these associations do not wholly clarify why particular narratives reference ephemeral apertures, or umbri, that appear to traverse the rock in manners discordant with the documented relief, nor why nautical charts from diverse eras diverge on the exact configuration of the vaults prior to their chronicled disintegrations, bequeathing a slender demarcation betwixt scrutiny and perception that withstands total harmonization. And when pondering the extended lithological prognosis, authorities concur that the rock persists in its gradual diminution, its vault enfeebled by centuries of kinetic abrasion. Yet the rhythm of transformation stays unforeseeable, with trivial vernal gales sporadically incising more profoundly than substantial ones, and yielding scree accumulations dissipating into the gulf swifter than projections foresee, intimating that occult mechanisms persist operative within its bulk. And such ambiguities permit latitude for suppositions both prudent and visionary, encompassing the concept that the rock's interior stratification planes, assembled in faintly distinct ecological circumstances, react to tension in asymmetrical fashions that engender the semblance of purposeful molding, or that the arrangement of its projections and hollows once generated in sonic phenomenon, an innate amplifier or breeze conduit that inspired primordial beholders to impute volition where none subsisted. While others speculate whether the encircling ocean floor with its precipitous profundity alterations and curiously even platforms conserves indications of an archaic, literal order now, submerged beneath the waves, perchance affiliated with regional myths that recount a terrain, transmuting after a grand convulsion or thunderous occurrence. And though these filaments linger unverified, they augment the encounter of beholding the surges recede, to unveil the constricted passage segregating the obelisk from the continent. For in those instants, the rock appears simultaneously detached and interlinked, a relic engendered from a realm vastly dissimilar, yet still tethered to the cadences molding the contemporary coast, its immense exterior radiating aureate at twilight, as if transiently disclosing the innumerable revolutions that conveyed it hither. Each particle of limestone a shard of something elder than the bluff, the peninsula, or even the yawning gulf. And as pulverulence alights and the breeze hushes along the littoral, the edifice's contour assumes a tranquility that neither erudition nor anecdote wholly seizes, beckoning the query of how many additional contours it once bore prior to climb, divesting them, and what guises it may adopt, protracted after beholders have progressed bequeathing solely the steadfast toil of surge and epoch to perpetuate the chronicle that commenced eons before any endeavored to discern significance from a solitary soaring lithic. Stawamus Chief. At the meridional verge of House Sound, where compact littoral woodlands ascend precipitously into granitic barriers burnished by archaic frost, the Stawamus Chief erects in stratified levels that intercept the fluctuating radiance like the treads of an incomplete obelisk. Its colossal mass constituted from a solitary plutonic entity unveiled by the recession of glaciers that formerly compressed against it with incalculable mass, bequeathing behind striations and sleek vaults that intimate of an effaced realm of pulverizing frost and meltwater cascades. Yet its essence evokes more deliberate than fortuitous, as though the elevation were situated to dominate the constricting fjord. Its three foremost apexes, oriented in a fashion that has enduringly attracted the regard of ascenders, lithologists, and coast Salish narrators who esteem the terrain not merely as lithic, but as a depository of forebear reminiscence, its bluffs resonating dissimilarly, amid particular atmospheric transitions yielding subdued intonations that traverse the dale-like remote respiration. And as investigators scrutinize the chief's granodiorite constitution, coarse-textured, embedded with feldspar and hornblende, and riven into prodigious laminae by delamination, they discern proof of profound terrestrial mechanisms congealed in situ. A ledger of magma congealing languidly beneath primordial elevations that were subsequently effaced by the inexorable surge of frost. Yet even this lucid lithological chronicle encompasses minor conundrums, such as segregated groupings of rounded potholes elevated far above contemporary drainage trajectories and eroded conduits, that appeared sleek and uninterrupted to stem solely from tumbling meltwater, provoking the prospect that subglacial deluges once inundated across the evolving bluff exteriors with capacities and celerities arduous to reconstitute, and on particular projections where lichen tapestries adhere to the lithic-like survivals of an antique weaving. Archaeologists have unearthed dispersed lithic spalls, whose provenances linger indeterminate, intimating that folk may have scaled segments of the massif, not simply for transit but for scrutiny, utilizing specific overlooks that proffer unhindered vistas of House Sound and its fluctuating fluxes. Though the dearth of hearth vestiges or evident occupancy attributes obfuscates interpretations, bequeathing ajar whether these relics denote ephemeral transits, ceremonial interludes, or pursuits unrelated to colonization. Meanwhile, structural lithologists delineate a sequence of hyperpendicular fissures that partition the chief into colossal segments, observing that their bearings interact with geolith sequences in nuanced fashions that sporadically dispatch boulders tumbling from the sides, sans forewarning. Yet the schema of these ruptures also corresponds oddly with particular superficial attributes on contiguous summits. Deckening conjecture about a vaster tension order that once regulated the entire dale, perchance swayed by glacial compression, or elder seismic recalibrations, now veiled by subsequent abrasion. And as the daylight tempers and umbri withdraw from the bluffs, pallid streaks materialize where moisture permeates through otherwise arid lithic, delineating slender trajectories that certain construe as survivals of antecedent drainage lattice. Though their discontinuous courses allude to paroxysms, when the elevation's superficial states diverged markedly from those of the present, perhaps amid intervals when an ice-barred tarn inundated portions of the sound or when glacial lobes compressed against the chief's inferior inclines, compelling meltwater to course across anomalous routes. And the more scholars endeavor to reconstitute a conclusive chronology, the more the elevation's attributes withstand oversimplification, delaminating vaults that appear more juvenile than their quantified era is intimate, scree heaps that seem disproportionately modest for the bluffs overhead, and abrasion depressions whose schemas fluctuate inexplicably from one level to the subsequent, forging a tessellation of indications that repudiate coalescing into a solitary, coherent progression. Yet these ambiguities also bestow upon the massifé aura of subdued profundity. For as one delineates the expansive, inclining platforms ascending toward the apexes, the woodland attenuates and gales convey the aroma of the sea, and the lithic, temperate in afternoon radiance, unveils mineral scintillations that appear to fluctuate as clouds traverse aloft, resounding chronicles from prior adventurers who observed how the elevation's guise transmuted with each hour, engendering impressions of nuanced motion where none subsisted, erect upon the superior crests where corvids orbit in muteness, and the remote thunder of cascades ascends through the arboreal. The prodigious granitic barrier appears both immutable and curiously susceptible, its exteriors incised with the reminiscence of frost, yet ajar to whatever novel dynamics may one day refashion it, bequeathing beholders to ponder how many revolutions of progression and recession it has already withstood, and how many more it may sustain prior to its accustomed contours dissolve into another. Configuration recollected solely in segregated shards of lithic that will persist in descending, relocating, and subsiding as the protracted chronicle of the chief unfolds beyond the ambit of any solitary epoch. Hopewell Rocks. Along the superior extents of the Bay of Fundy, where surges ascend and descend with a potency unparalleled elsewhere upon the globe. The Hopewell Rocks erect in subdued ranks along the bluff foundation like eroded guardians, molded by a patient and interminable colloquy betwixt lithic and moisture. Their soaring guises, constricted-waisted, expansive, crowned, and cloaked in superficial flora, bearing the indisputable imprint of tidal revolutions that elevate and depress the sea by more than a dozen meters each diurnal, unveiling a littoral that appears to respire as breadths of ocean floor alternately vanish and materialize. And though the rocks themselves are hewn from comparatively yielding carboniferous sandstone, their perseverance intimates that something in their constitution or placement has permitted them to withstand disintegration longer than encircling bluffs, which recede at a rhythm discernible within human spans, their exteriors flaking beneath the amalgamated toil of surge kinetics, gelidity, in periodic drainage bequeathing behind residual spires that evoke less lithological leavings and more reluctant perturers of a formerly unbroken escarpment, each bearing nuanced divergences in hue and consistency where iron-laden strata intersect with obscure clay-impregnated laminae, chronicling primordial fluvial deltas that disseminated across this territory when interior woodlands and fen systems prevailed the panorama. Yet, even with this basal comprehension, scholars observe minor discrepancies, inclinations of subscouring, that diverge acutely from forecasted schemas, projections of resilient substance that materialize out of sequence, and a scattering of lithics whose bearings appear to contravene the anticipated. Motifs of gyratory abrasion induced by tidal vortices, provoking the inquiry into whether microfissures, unseen load-sustaining spines, or concealed interior consolidation exert a grander role than heretofore presumed in ascertaining which spires endure and which disintegrate with scant forewarning. And as the surge hastens inward across the silt flats, its progression hastened by the funnel-shaped configuration of the bay. The moisture spirals around each configuration in fashions that transmute subtly with each season, yielding swirling whirlpools that elevate fine alluvia into suspension and transiently hue the sea, a dense terrestrial russet. An outcome the primordial. Micmac beholders wove into a terrain chronicle grounded in the transit of essences and the respiration of the sea, observing how the rocks fluctuate in guise with the surge, sometimes towering as landforms, sometimes contracting into floral-capped isles. Their contours transfiguring within hours, in a manner that could be construed as a memento of the globe's fluidity. And subsequently, European appraisers, confronting the locale protracted before literal steadiness was adequately comprehended, chronicled unanticipated divergences in bluff trajectory gauges, sporadically observing that particular spires appeared modified betwixt sojourns. Though it lingers indeterminate whether these reports mirror genuine transmutation, observational lapses, or the manner in which Umbrian surge altitude can modify the perception of volume and guise. Meanwhile, as contemporary geomorphologists deploy laser scanning apparatuses to monitor micro-alterations, they discern that the exteriors migrate in intricate schemas, certain zones abrading swiftly, others scarcely transmuting across manifold years, intimating that minuscule fluctuations in humidity retention, mineral consolidation, or interior ruptures may wield disproportionate dominion over the abrasion progression. Yet the particulars do not wholly elucidate why particular spires cultivate dramatic hourglass contours while contiguous ones retain comparatively sturdy guises despite analogous exposure. And when gales traverse the bay, their surges amplified by the constricting coastline. The rocks withstand abrupt paroxysms of kinetic potency manifold times greater than average states, scouring their foundations and depositing coarse gravels and schemas that have perplexed sedimentologists, who observe that some gravel expanses appear inverted with larger clasts, mysteriously situated above finer ones, alluding to swift depositional throbs or ephemeral inundations whose kinetics linger imperfectly comprehended. And at the foundation of several configurations, diminutive recesses unfold into shallow coves where carved conduits intimate antecedent moisture trajectories now marooned above customary tidal grasp, implying either short-term alterations in tidal amplitude, gale-propelled overtopping incidents, or a protracted succession of bluff recession that has bequeathed these imprints suspended in perplexing placements, none of which wholly correspond with current reconstitutions. Yet these ambiguities bestow upon the panorama a nuanced profundity. For as one ambulates along the ocean floor at ebb tide, traversing betwixt soaring spires softened by the lenient oscillation of seaweed at their foundations, the rocks appear to alternate betwixt permanence and ephemerality, their exteriors stippled with quartz granules that intercept the radiance while fine clay limoni dissolve beneath the merest caress of precipitation, mirroring a tension betwixt perseverance and susceptibility. And as the surge reverts with the velocity of a sealing portal inundating conduits, and spiraling around the foundations of the configurations with revitalized intent, the spires ascend once more from the moisture-like archaic indicators, charting the transit of innumerable revolutions of progression and recession, their contours fluctuating against the firmament as though admonishing beholders that their perdurance is ephemeral, equilibrated delicately betwixt dynamics that have molded this coast across millions of years. And when pulverulins alights across the bay, stilling the surf and projecting elongated umbri that obfuscate the demarcation betwixt rock and bluff the configurations, maintain a tranquility that evokes elder than their quantifiable eras beckoning. Contemplation of how many additional guises once erect here prior to capitulating to disintegration, and how many more might materialize as the literal persists in withdrawing bequeathing behind novel spires whose chronicles will likewise unfold in shards of lithic surge and unresolved inquiries that linger protracted after the moisture has ascended to veil them anew. where the Milk River meanders through the sun-scorched badlands of southern Alberta. Riding on Stone Provincial Park unveils a panorama molded as much by muteness as by breeze. In a colloquy that encompasses centuries, the yielding lithic chronicling not solely the transits of moisture and abrasion, but the protracted presence of Blackfoot peoples who inscribed silhouettes, armaments, beasts, and cryptic guises into the rock. Each imprint eroded by epoch until the images evoke both proximate and remote, as if emanating from the lithic itself. And the coulees that descend toward the river bear the hallmark of archaic inundation throbs, their barriers hewn into fluted spires. And projections where nuanced divergences in granule magnitude have engendered schemas of differential abrasion that perplex geomorphologists. For while much of the territory's molding can be ascribed to gelid thaw sequences and the languid scouring of wind-borne alluvia, particular alcoves and acutely tapered pinnacles exhibit a refinement discordant with customary prairie erosion, alluding to infrequent climatic paroxysms or ephemeral intervals of more vehement drainage than the current basin sustains. Yet it is the incisions pecked and incised across expansive panels that amplify the aura of stratified chronicle, their dissemination delineating trajectories and overlooks that may once have functioned as sentinel stations, ethereal locales, or chronicle-keeping barriers. Though archaeologists persist in debating the progression of their genesis, observing that superimposed silhouettes and stylistic transmutations intimate multiple phases of inscription segregated by substantial spans, with some glyphs so tenuous that they appear more like spectral imprints bequeathed by antecedent implements than while the principal chronicle directs toward a enduring cultural perpetuity. Particular anomalies obfuscate the chronology encompassing silhouettes whose style appears mismatched with acknowledged phases of Blackfoot rock art, their contours more angular or abstract than anticipated, provoking inquiries into whether these represent lesser recognized regional heritages, post-contact augmentations, or the tenuous survivals of much elder imprints partially refashioned by subsequent limbs. And as the river undulates along the dale floor, its embankment speckled with cottonwoods that project fluctuating umbre on the bluffs, the interplay of radiance unveils nuanced striations where mineral elution has discolored the rock with iron and manganese, forging obscure bands that sometimes intersect with incised silhouettes in fashions that veil their primordial guises, prompting contentions over which components are deliberate and which are artifacts of erosion. For in some panels, the innate discolorations imitate human imprints so intimately that even high-resolution scans cannot wholly resolve the distinction. The park's configurations fluctuate dramatically in altitude, slenderness, and equilibrium, with some perched atop improbably constricted pedestals that appear to contravene the anticipated rhythm of basal abrasion, lending to conjecture that microscopic consolidation divergences, perchance affiliated with archaic subterranean moisture fluxes, have fortified certain limoni in a fashion not readily discerned by superficial sampling. And on the elevated crests overlooking the dale, where the gale conveys the arid aroma of sage and the river Susurrus becomes a remote menace of tone, segregated lithic shards intimate at ephemeral encampments or pursuit zones, though their milieu lingers elusive, as fluctuating sands and abrading inclines have relocated manifold relics from their primordial placements, bequeathing a jar whether these locales functioned as temporal waypoints, ceremonial grounds, or simply transient halts along broader transit routes. And as the diurnal fervor tempers into vesper and the bluffs radiate with a subdued crimson luminescence, the compactness of petroglyphs becomes more evident, silhouettes materializing gradually as umbre elongates, some appearing acute and volitional, others eroded to nigh visibility, their essences obfuscated by centuries of frost, spalling, and granular dissolution. A panorama that conserves more than it elucidates, proffering a ledger affluent enough to beckon interpretation, yet incomplete enough to withstand assurance. And with each transient season, the incisions erode further, their exteriors forfeiting microscopic shards to breeze and precipitation. Even as freshly unveiled panels materialize when fragments of bluff disintegrate, alluding to supplementary chapters still concealed within the lithic, waiting the languid abrasion of epoch to convey them into vista. And as crepuscule alights over the dale and the rock exteriors temperate, the incisions retreat once more into the dimness, bequeathing solely the aura that this locale molded by dynamics both human and lithological persists in harboring chronicles that extend beyond the ambit of conclusive comprehension, suspended in the sandstone that has witnessed eras of transmutation, yet still shelters the subdued contours of existences, panoramas, and instants that cannot be wholly reclaimed. Mingan, archipelago, monoliths, scattered across the Gulf of St. Lawrence like a convocation of solitary silhouettes. The Mingan Archipelago. Monoliths ascend from tidal flats and wooded islets in guises so diverse and meticulous that they appear less the product of innate erosion and the detritus of some scrupulous archaic curation. Their limestone forms hewn across millennia by an amalgamation of surge-scouring chemical dissolution and inexorable gelid thaw sequences that have excavated them into spires, toadstools, keels, and improbable shafts, equilibrated on constricted pedestals that fluctuate subtly with each season's abrasion. And as one nears these configurations, the consistency of the lithic unveils a compact fossil lattice. Crinoids, brachiopods, and coral shards interwoven into the rock like a repository of Ordovician seas. Yet the chronological lucidity proffered by this fossil ledger stands in subdued juxtaposition to the monolith's contemporary guises, which exhibit divergences arduous to simulate. For some spires erode from the foundation upward in graceful constrictions, while others cultivate profound horizontal indentations that do not correspond with acknowledged tidal orders or gale inundation schemas, intimating that the interplay of subterranean moisture permeation, microfissure dissemination, and nuanced chemical gradients may diverge dramatically even across brief spans, and on particular isles where the monoliths aggregate like an inadvertent circlet of erect lithics, their bearings display no steadfast correspondence. Yet a few appear inclined toward apertures in the encircling bluffs. A fortuity that has intrigued scholars studying the archipelago as paleoliteral, who advanced that antecedent moisture altitudes. Or archaic drainage trajectories may have swayed the bearings of feeblest dissolution. Though the variegated dissemination of resilient limoni engenders complications as segregated layers of magnesium-laden limestone appear to have decelerated abrasion in unforeseeable fashions, producing protuberances and projections that seem almost volitional. Meanwhile, the encircling topography, even bedrock pavements pocked with dissolution, depressions, and riddled with constrictions, offers proof of a protracted chronicle of karstic kinetics. Though the presence of unusually sleek hollows at altitudes above contemporary spray zones provokes inquiries about elder climatic intervals when moisture states or thicker humus mantle may have hastened chemical abrasion prior to subsequent glacial scouring, divesting much of the encumbrance. And as botanists enumerate the sparse flora that adheres to crevices and projections, they observe that lichen progression has in some locales outstripped abrasion, forging protective sheaths that decelerate lithic forfeiture, while in other domains, the disintegration of lichen lattice appears to have unveiled pristine limestone to swift deterioration, unveiling a minor but enduring inconsistency betwixt biological colonization and monolith steadiness that obfuscates protracted prognoses. And the human imprint here, though nuanced, appends another stratum of intrigue. For primordial Inuit voyagers navigating these waterways depicted the isles as locales where lithic silhouettes bore the reminiscence of fluctuating essences, their contours transmuting with haze, surge, and inclination of approach. And subsequently, European adventurers chronicled analogous impressions, observing how particular monoliths appear to alter guise when beheld against diverse horizons. A perception that contemporary beholders still confront due to the beguiling simplicity of the panorama where shallow relief and low-lying flora render spans and proportions arduous to adjudicate, bestowing upon the configurations an uncanny propensity to appear nearer or loftier than their veritable magnitude. And ongoing inquiries utilizing laser mapping illuminate supplementary conundrums. Infinitesimal inclinations, at the foundation of some spires that do not correlate with bedrock ruptures, and nuanced, superficial pitting that hastens in schemas, discordant with prevailing gale bearings, leading scholars to ponder whether antecedent paroxysms of extreme climb, perchance affiliated with postglacial, atmospheric instability once unveiled the monoliths' two abrasive dynamics no longer extant today, bequeathing behind hallmarks that cannot be directly emulated. Yet, despite these ambiguities, the configurations endure in a species of subdued equilibrium, their contours fluctuating with the sun as the sea withdraws to unveil tide pools, fossil substrates, and constricted conduits winding betwixt the spires, each recess bearing vestiges of the archipelago's protracted molding, and as vesper radiance disseminates across the limestone exteriors. Accentuating every furrow and indentation, the monoliths assume an almost narrative essence, as though each curvature and hollow were the survival of a chronicle eroded nigh sleek by epoch. And when obscurity aggregates along the isle verges, the steadfast cadence of surges supplants the diurnal's acute delineation, the configurations retreat into contours that coalesce with the encircling tranquility, bequeathing solely the aura that their current guises are ephemeral repose, loci in a far protracted transmutation, one whose inception resides in archaic seas, and whose termination may arrive protracted after the archipelago itself has transmuted into novel guises. Conveying onward, arcana molded not by volition but by the patient, intricate toil of surges, lithic, and the languid perseverance of epoch. Flowerpot Island rock pillars, sending from the azure shallows of Georgian Bay, with guises that appear simultaneously precarious and volitional. The Flowerpot Island rock pillars erect as residual effigies hewn from the island's dolostone perimeter, their tall, tapering forms attenuating toward the foundation where centuries of surge kinetics, frost propulsion, and chemical abrasion have pared the lithic into contours reminiscent of fabricated receptacles. Though the longer one scrutinizes their exteriors, the clearer it becomes that the dynamics molding them rarely conducted in foreseeable increments, instead operating through uneven throbs of erosion that bequeath the spires with ridges, projections, and nuanced textural juxtapositions that intimate of an intricate interplay of lithology and climb, while the general chronicle directs toward the Niagara Escarpment's genesis, its Dahlstone caprock indurating as magnesium-laden moisture transmuted archaic limestone, bestowing upon this territory a resilience that permitted bluffs and projections to endure. Flowerpot Island's spires proffer finer granule conundrums. For although both foremost structures stand segregated from the continental bluffs, their erosional chronicles diverge in fashions not wholly elucidated by uniform kinetics, with one displaying an acutely subscoured waist and the other sustaining a comparatively sturdy midsection, intimating nuanced divergences in lamination, thickness, fossil incorporations, or the presence of chert nodules that may have withstood dissolution unevenly. And along the littoral, where surge-eroded boulders reposed, scattered like fractured kin of the perduring spires, the dissemination of rubble alludes to paroxysmal disintegration incidents rather than steadfast attrition. For some segments appear freshly riven, while others have softened into rounded guises. It's discordant with recent severance, provoking the inquiry into whether particular descents coincided with eras of elevated lake altitude variability. No comparable settlement exists in the region before or immediately after Arkham, suggesting the appearance of a sophisticated urban culture that rose suddenly and disappeared just as abruptly. The site also shows signs of intentional burning. Roofs collapsed inward, walls blackened, and debris layers indicate the city was destroyed in a controlled fire. It's possibly abandoned rather than conquered, which is puzzling given the enormous effort required to build it. If Arkham was a center of ritual, governance, and metallurgy, why would its inhabitants burn it down themselves? Further, contradictions emerge in the artifacts. Some pottery styles seem local, while others show influences from cultures thousands of kilometers away, hinting at trade networks or migrations that mainstream timelines struggle to explain. Chemical analysis of metal objects reveals advanced alloying techniques, including high-quality bronze with controlled tin percentages, unusually sophisticated for a community allegedly lacking cities. The entire settlement appears to have been designed before construction began, with measurements suggesting knowledge of proportional systems and perhaps even early geometry. Yet no written records exist, no precursor designs, and no master plan preserved in material form. These anomalies have opened the door to a wide spectrum of speculation. Some archaeologists propose Arsam was a ceremonial center for an early Indo-Iranian priesthood, a place where the movements of stars were observed to guide rituals, calendars, and agricultural cycles. Others suggest it was a training ground for chariot warriors, a cradle of Proto-European culture whose innovations later spread. Across Eurasia, more adventurous theories imagine Arkham as a prototype ideal city, built according to sacred geometric principles passed down through priestly lineages that later influenced Persian, Indian, and Scythian cosmologies. Fringe investigators argue that Arsham's city plan resembles mandala patterns from ancient Vedic texts or mirrors astronomical charts embedded in early mythologies. Some claim that the precise circular design indicates knowledge of advanced surveying techniques or even lost mathematics that predate Greek geometry. Others propose that Arkham was part of a broader network of ring cities across the Eurasian steppe, many of which remain buried or unrecognized. A small but vocal group believes the settlement was an ancient observatory built by a culture with an unusually deep understanding of celestial mechanics, perhaps to track precession, eclipses, or long-term astronomical cycles, far earlier than officially recognized. Locals add their own layers of mystique. Modern pilgrims visit Arkham believing it to be a place of spiritual energy, claiming the circular layout channels cosmic forces or enhances meditation. Some legends speak of ancient sages who built Arkham as a gateway between the earthly and celestial worlds, while others imagine it as the birthplace of mythical Aryan ancestors mentioned in ancient texts. And yet, despite decades of study, Arkham refuses to reveal its full story. The city was planned with extraordinary foresight, built with advanced engineering, aligned with the heavens, inhabited for a brief period, and then deliberately set ablaze, all without leaving behind a written language or a direct descendant culture to explain its purpose. So Arkham remains one of Russia's greatest archaeological enigmas, a perfect circle on the lonely steppe. A city that appears and disappears like a mirage in history, hinting that somewhere in humanity's Bronze Age past, there may have been societies with far more knowledge and far deeper mysteries than we ever imagined. Mount Vodavara, in the remote forests of Karelia, where spruce trees stretch endlessly toward a gray northern sky, and mist rolls across silent lakes, rises Mount Vodavara, a barren, rocky summit so strange that many visitors say it feels like stepping into another world. A place where nature and ancient engineering blur, until you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. At a distance, the mountain looks unremarkable. But as you climb its twisted slopes, the landscape transforms enormous boulders, balanced precariously on tiny stones. Long stone ridges forming unnatural straight lines. Fissures that appear like cut stairways and clusters of megaliths perched in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Over 1,600 bizarre setas, sacred stones of the ancient Sami people, dot the mountaintop, many placed on delicate pivot points that allow them to sway slightly with the wind, producing faint vibrating sounds. The summit is also covered with deep rectangular cracks in the bedrock, some stretching tens of meters, forming platforms, terraces, and corridors that resemble the ruins of a collapsed stone complex. Archaeologists mapping the area found stones arranged in circles, alignments that point toward solstice, sunsets, and strange step formations in the granite that look like carved stairways leading nowhere. Radiourban testing on charcoal traces suggests human activity on the mountain more than 4,000 years ago. And Sami oral tradition identifies Vedavara as a sacred site where shamans performed rituals, communicated with spirits, and traveled between the worlds of the living and the dead. Yet, the deeper researchers look, the more contradictions emerge. Geologists argue that most formations were caused by a powerful earthquake 9,000 years ago, shattering the bedrock into slabs and leaving debris fields that only appear artificial. However, this explanation does not account for the dozens of perched stones placed atop smooth boulders with intentional balance points. Nor does it explain why many megaliths align with astronomical directions, or why some stones form perfect right angles and flat surfaces that look as though they were shaped deliberately. Visitors report smooth-cut faces on certain stones, as if carved with tools and holes drilled deep into granite. features that are extremely difficult to produce even with modern equipment. Another contradiction lies in the sheer number of formations. No other mountain in the region displays anything remotely comparable in density or complexity. If this were purely geological chaos, why does it resemble a megalithic ritual landscape? And why is the mountain nearly devoid of soil and vegetation at the summit while surrounding areas flourish? A pattern some researchers claim align with ancient clearing and intentional construction. These inconsistencies have sparked waves of speculation. Some archaeologists cautiously propose that Neolithic or Bronze Age cultures enhanced natural formations to create a vast ritual complex similar to sacred Sami Mountains in northern Scandinavia. Others argue that Vodavara served as a shamanic pilgrimage site, where the unusual acoustics created by hollow fractures in the rock amplified drums, chants, and whistles during ceremonies intended to induce trance states. More adventurous theorists claim the mountaintop was a prehistoric observatory, pointing to alignments between the stones and major celestial events, while some believe it was an ancient gateway site where shamans symbolically descended into the underworld through deep fractures in the rock. Fringe researchers go further, suggesting the stone alignments resemble those found in megalithic cultures thousands of kilometers away, hinting at shared knowledge or a forgotten northern tradition of sacred stone engineering. Others speculate that the balanced stones are remnants of a lost megalithic practice involving energy flows, seismic tuning, or geomagnetic awareness, citing unusual electromagnetic readings recorded near certain formations. More extreme interpretations imagine Vodavara as a partially ruined prehistoric temple complex, a relic of an advanced culture erased by the Ice Age or ancient catastrophes, with the earthquake acting as both destroyer and revealer of an older structure. Local legends fuel the mystery. Karelian folklore describes Vodavara as a mountain inhabited by spirits, a place where the boundary between worlds is thin. Some stories say the dead walk here on foggy nights. Others claim shamans ascended the peak to leave the physical world entirely. Modern hikers often report strange sensations, sudden silence, disorientation, feelings of being watched, while photographers capture inexplicable fog banks that form and disappear within minutes. Even today, many loses avoid the mountain, saying it has power that does not belong to humans. Yet, despite surveys, expeditions, and satellite imagery, Vodavara refuses to provide a clear answer. The stones balance but do not fall. The alignments exist but cannot be definitively explained. And the mountain's fractured geometry feels both natural and impossibly sculpted. And so, Mount Vodavara remains one of Russia's most haunting enigmas. A windswept summit covered in balanced stones and mysterious formations, a place where geology imitates architecture, where ancient rituals left traces but no explanations, where the silence of the mountain whispers the same unanswered question. Whether these patterns were shaped by the forces of nature, the hands of forgotten builders, or something in between, they confront patches of unexpectedly slender humus, where windswept diabase pavements materialize in sleek, obscure expanses, their exteriors incised with tenuous striations that may mirror the final progressions of glacial frost or the abrasive kinetics of debriled and meltwater once coursing across the plateau. Though the bearings of these imprints do not invariably correspond cleanly with regional glacial flux reconstitutions, bequeathing ajar the prospect that local frost whirlpools or ephemeral, frost-barred tarns imparted unique hallmarks to the substratum, and the woodlands that mantled the giant's inferior flanks. Compact amalgamations of spruce, fir, and birch anchor themselves in crevices that descend far deeper than superficial ruptures intimate, their roots pursuing humidity into perpendicular fissures that allude to an intricate lattice of fissures beneath the massif's exterior, some of which yield tenuous resonant tones when vernal gales traverse across the bluffs. A phenomenon that primordial voyagers sometimes construed as the giant respiring or relocating, though contemporary elucidations center on the sonic outcomes of breeze passing over profound constricted hollows whose dimensions linger only partially delineated. And offshore, the lake profundance abruptly along a submerged bluff trajectory that mirrors the giant's profile. Its submerged inclines strewn with angular segments that scholars date to manifold disintegration paroxysms, though the chronology of these incidents lingers indeterminate. Obfuscated by fluctuating post-glacial lake altitudes and the arduousness of distinguishing archaic rockfalls from more recent, ones that bequeath minimal alluvia mantle. And divers scrutinizing these submerged inclines recount curious platforms hewn into the diabase at profundities that appear discordant with acknowledged lake altitude chronicles, prompting conjecture about antecedent erosional phases or ephemeral moisture bodies whose extents have not been wholly reconstituted. Though the proof lingers sparse and readily veiled by the lake's fluctuating alluvia, yet despite these ambiguities, the massif lingers remarkably cohesive. Its contour intact even after thousands of gelid cycles and inexorable superior gales, though nuanced transmutations chronicled in recent decades. Fresh ruptures along the thorax minor bluff, disintegrations near the knees, and the languid recession of scree expanses intimate that the giant is entering a novel phase of erosion whose resolution may refashion portions of its contour across centuries rather than millennia. And as Vesper descends across the bay, the silhouette obscures into a prodigious, tranquil essence. Its verge is softened by the waning radiance until the giant appears less like a lithological edifice and more like a chronicle rendered manifest in lithic convergence of archaic magmatic dynamics, glacial molding, and human interpretation that together forge a guise that evokes both anchored and elusive, beckoning the lingering. Reflection that the contour we acknowledge today constitutes solely one chapter in a much protracted continuum of guises the terrain has assumed and may yet assume anew. As the languid operations of moisture, frost, and epoch persist in progressing patiently across the slumbering silhouette that sentinels over the lake, stone pipes of Nahanni Valley. In the secluded interior of the Northwest Territories, where sheer limestone bluffs ascend above vaporous dales, and the Nahanni River incises profoundly through a labyrinth of chasms. The stone pipes of the Nahanni Valley erect as slender cryptic spires embedded within a panorama already denoted by extremes. Their tall cylindrical guises emerging from prodigious karst barriers, as though the lithic had been induced into perpendicular flues that contravened the encircling configuration. Each one molded by kinetics, both recognizable and faintly elusive, hewn from archaic carbonate substrates that once submerged beneath temperate Paleozoic seas prior to elevation, dissolution, and gelidity, commencing to labor them into their current contours. And the dale itself subject to seasonal temperature oscillations that span from humid fervor to piercing aldehyde, unganders. A cycle of gelid thaw that broadens fissures and unforeseeable throbs, which aids in elucidating the genesis of pinnacles and pipes, emblematic of mature karst. Yet, the Nahanni exemplars diverge in both magnitude and interspacing. For some erect isolated on constricted projections far above the chasm floor, while others aggregate in clusters where the lamination planes should, in theory, foster broader disintegration rather than the conservation of such slender survivals, bequeathing geomorphologists to ponder over the interplay of microfissure lattice, subterranean drainage trajectories, and the mineral constitution of specific limestone laminae that may have permitted certain segments to withstand dissolution while contiguous rocks capitulated. And as venturers traverse the precipitous scree beneath these configurations, they observe inconsistencies in the rubble expanses. Some pipes display abundant descended segments, while others appear to have divested scant substance. Their foundations nigh pristine, despite evident erosion aloft, intimating paroxysms of disintegration that transpired eons past, followed by eras of relative steadiness that do not wholly correspond with regional climatic ledgers. And on closer scrutiny, the exteriors of the pipes unveil perpendicular fluting and scalloped hollows typical of solution abrasion. But these attributes sometimes prolong beyond domains where active moisture drainage would be anticipated, implying that antecedent hydrological orders, perchance moisture eras following deglaciation, or ephemeral, elevated aquifers within the bluffs once, swayed the erosional schema in fashions no longer readily visible. And the tenuous mineral incrustations that mantle some recesses intimate at intermittent permeation that has since attenuated, bequeathing behind solely a residue of dissolved and reprecipitated carbonates. Meanwhile, the indigenous chronicles rooted in the territory recount of vigilant presences affiliated with the soaring bluffs, a aura of sentience ascribed not to specific spires, but to the terrain itself. And while these narratives do not designate the stone pipes directly, the resonance betwixt cultural reminiscence and the dale's imposing guises appends another stratum of milieu, especially when, pondering that the spires often occupy overlooked surveying trajectories, utilized for seasonal transit and pursuit. Their placements corresponded not with any discernible lithological schema, but with visual conduits that prolong profoundly into contiguous chasms. A fortuity that may simply mirror the structural idiosyncrasies of the substratum, yet conveys an aura of volition when beheld from certain inclinations. And as lithologists delineate the bearings of the pipes, they discern subtle deviations from perpendicularity that correlate with regional tension fields. Diminutive inclinations to the west or south that may intimate the perduring sway of archaic seismic compression. Although these inclinations prove inconsistent across the dale, with some pipes inclining in bearings that contravene broader structural tendencies, provoking the prospect that localized subsidence, concealed hollows, or variable frost wedging contributed, to bearings that appear coherent solely at the magnitude of individual configurations. And in the shadowed recesses of the chasm barriers, where gelid air aggregates and lingers, the pipes exhibit noticeably languider abrasion, the lithic retaining acute ridges where elsewhere the exteriors have softened into rounded curvatures, intimating a fragile poise betwixt temperature, humidity, and air flux that engenders microclimates capable of conserving certain attributes protracted after their equivalents on unveiled bluffs have eroded away. Yet even this dynamic encompasses inconsistencies. For some highly unveiled pipes display unexpectedly acute verges, their resilience ascribed by some scholars to nuanced divergences in dolomitization or trace contaminants that indorate specific limoni. Though core sampling lingers constrained due to the configuration's precarious placements, bequeathing these suppositions unverified. And the broader dale, with its silted river curves and thermal springs that intimate at profounder hydrogeological trajectories, pens further intricacy. For historical accounts depict subterranean tremors and abrupt rock descents that refashion portions of the chasm lattice in the last century. But the affiliation betwixt these incidents and the pipes lingers tenuous as manifold spires display no traces of recent perturbation, despite reposing near acknowledged disintegration domains, intimating that their steadiness depends less on regional seismicity and more on the interior cohesion of discrete lithic shafts whose provenances linger arduous to trace fully. And as the sun descends behind the elevated ramparts of the dale, the pipes project elongated, as constricted umbri that elongate across the chasm barriers like mute indicators of lithological epoch, their contours accentuating the improbable essence of their perdurance in a locale defined by ceaseless transmutation. And in the fluctuating radiance, they appear to hover betwixt ephemerality and perseverance, beckoning reflection on how many such guises may have once subsisted prior to the dale's inexorable kinetics, reducing them to the scant that endure. And with pulverulence alighting in, and the breeze progressing softly across the bluffs, the configurations retreat into the dimness, their contours coalescing with the broader perimeters of the chasm until they become integral to the vaster enigma of the Nahani panorama, a locale where lithic climb and profound epoch interact in fashions that withstand lucid interpretation, bequeathing the pipes as perduring mementos of dynamics both comprehended and unknown, molded into guises that maintain their elucidations loosely, as though awaiting a convergence of scrutiny and forbearance that may one day unveil more than the dale currently elects to disclose. Qajartalik petroglyph site. On a breeze-scoured promontory overlooking the gelid expanse of Hudson Strait, the Qajartalik petroglyph site disseminates across a broad steatite outcrop whose sleek ochre-gray exteriors harbor hundreds of incised countenances that appear to materialize gradually as the radiance fluctuates. Their attributes at once stark and dissolving, as though the lithic were recollecting and forgetting them in the identical respiration. Each mask-like silhouette pecked or incised into the yielding talcrich rock by Dorset artisans more than a millennium antecedent. Their motifs, resounding guises, encountered in portable effigies across the eastern Arctic, while also diverging in fashions that bestow upon this locale its singular aura. And as one progresses across the incised panels, the nuanced divergences in technique become visible. Some countenances encircled by shallow, uninterrupted furrows, others delineated by a constellation of diminutive peck imprints. Yet the boundaries betwixt deliberate artistry and the innate rupture trajectories of the steatite prove often obfuscated. For the lithic's propensity to shear along foliation planes can emulate the contours of cheeks or brows, obfuscating endeavors to ascertain where cultural volition concludes and lithological fortuity commences. And in certain segments, tenuous superimposed silhouettes engender a palimpsest outcome, intimating multiple paroxysms of incisions segregated by temporal spans that cannot be precisely quantified. Their overlaid limoni alluding to ritual recurrence or fluctuating emblematic priorities within Dorset collectives whose broader existences linger only partially comprehended, though the compactness of imagery here implies a locale of heightened import perchance affiliated with seasonal transit routes. Marine pursuit overlooks or cosmological chronicles anchored in the encircling seascape. Yet the very profusion of imagery also provokes unresolved inquiries. For some clusters appear arrayed along nuanced arcs or diagonals that do not correspond with the innate configuration of the rock, prompting conjecture that the layout may have adhered to schemas meaningful to its creator's visual trajectories, ceremonial successions, or correspondences with horizon loci. Although the dearth of steadfast bearing across the outcrop attenuates any solitary elucidation in the lithic itself, contributes to the ambiguity. Its yielding exteriors eroding swiftly under gelithaw sequences that broaden microcrevices and compel slender flakes to detach, effacing verges and coalescing once distinct countenances into spectral impressions whose primordial proportions now prove impossible to reconstitute. While in sheltered recesses, rare incisions retain acute trajectories that contrast acutely with their eroded neighbors, unveiling how uneven exposure has molded the site's contemporary guise. And as archaeologists scrutinize these divergences, they observe localized patches of obscura patina where mineral sheaths have alighted into the incisions, yielding a profundity of juxtaposition that attenuates under direct solar, but intensifies under inclined illumination, forging the semblance that certain countenances sentinel from within the lithic rather than upon it. It's an outcome amplified by the low raking radiance of dawn and dusk when encircling umbri acute the relief. Yet even with contemporary mapping techniques, inconsistencies endure. Some silhouettes appear abruptly truncated where ruptures have unfolded, while others prove partly veiled by lichen that proliferates in schemas unrelated to the incisions, sporadically accentuating attributes by juxtaposition, and at other instances concealing them wholly, bestowing upon the site a dynamic essence in which visibility itself becomes contingent on season and clime. And beneath this fluctuating exterior resides a profounder conundrum involving the affiliation betwixt the petroglyphs and the broader quarrying chronicle of the outcrop. For steatite from Qajartalik proved long esteemed for the fabrication of lamps and receptacles and implement scars in remote corners of the site, intimate at extraction kinetics that annodate or overlap with the incision paroxysms, provoking the inquiry into whether the countenances were engendered in instance of interlude betwixt quarrying pursuits, or whether the resource locale and the ceremonial locale functioned autonomously, their proximity and fortuity of topography rather than intent. Yet some incised panels repose in domains unsuitable for quarrying, intimating that at least portion of the site was reserved for imagery rather than extraction, though the dearth of lucid spatial demarcations renders it arduous to distinguish volitional partitioning from coincidental aggregation, and the protracted chronicle of innate erosion further veils whatever organizational rationale once subsisted. And as the Arctic gales persist in progressing across the promontory, conveying saline mist from the strait and chilling the lithic even in summer, the petroglyphs fluctuate in guise once more, their contours acuting momentarily prior to retreating into the modulated consistencies of the eroded exterior, reinforcing the aura that this locale withstands any conclusive perusal. Its significance is disseminated across Lamonia of epoch clime, cultural reminiscence that intersect only briefly in the contemporary instant. And when vesper radiance attenuates and the sea's rhythmic inundation fills the muteness around the outcrop, the incised countenances appear to subside back into the lithic from which they emanated, bequeathing solely the tenuous aura of a convocation whose participants spanned centuries. Their expressions molded by limbs now protracted, departed, and by the languid, perduring dynamics that persist in modifying the exterior granule, by granule ensuring that Qajartalik remains both a ledger and a conundrum, a convergence of human volition and lithological transmutation whose full chronicle may always reside just beyond ambit.